Coming up in this episode.
I kept encountering modern scholars making these claims about it. Some even question, he's just an old guy starting to lose his mind and he can't even write Greek straight, all this kind of stuff. So I started thinking, well, wait a minute, yeah, but this was written in the ancient world and it was designed to be read aloud.
Yeah.
Maybe we're not reading this properly. We're judging it by our criteria in a largely predominantly silent reading culture. Mm-hmm. But we're not listening to the text.
Welcome to the Reflective Ecclesia podcast. Our aim is to edify the church towards deep thought and Christ-centered action. Let's jump right in. Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. If you are coming straight to this episode, you should know that this is part 2 of a conversation I'm having with Dr. Jeff Brickle, and I'll introduce him in a second. A lot of the stuff we're going to get into today assumes a foundation that we kind of covered in the first conversation we had. Now, you are more than welcome to jump right in and dive in for this conversation too, but if you're coming into this fresh, maybe take a second to go back and listen to the first one, unless you're already super familiar with this subject. In case you are just diving in, I'm going to take a second to reintroduce Dr. Brickle, and then we'll get into part 2 of the conversation. Dr. Jeff Brickle teaches New Testament studies in Greek at Urshan Graduate School of Theology in Wentzville, Missouri. And while he describes his research interests as eclectic, he focuses primarily on the confluence of Johannine literature with ancient media culture. That means aurality, sound mapping, memory arts, literary and book culture, performance, spatiality, and intertextuality. Again, if you don't know what any of those words mean, feel free to go back and watch part 1 of this conversation. Along with his published dissertation, Aural Design and Coherence in the First Century Media Culture, he also has contributed essays to the Fourth Gospel in First Century Media Culture, Rethinking the Ethics of John, Memory and Identity in Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity, and he also has contributed to Abiding Words, the use of Scripture in the Gospel of John, and Sound Matters, New Testament Studies and Sound Mapping. He has also written and edited for a more general readership, the Apostolic Study Bible, where he was a New Testament editor and contributor, the Handbook on the Gospels, and Handbook on the General Epistles and Revelation, which he co-authored. If that wasn't enough, Dr. Brickle has already been quite impressive with just that, but he's earned degrees from Harvard University. He has an ALB in religion, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he has an MA in urban ministry, and Concordia Seminary from St. Louis, where he has a PhD in biblical studies. Last but not least, his professional memberships include the Society of Biblical Literature, Society for Pentecostal Studies, and the Institute for Biblical Research. Dr. Brickle, I'm sorry for messing up your bio, but thank you so much for
No worries.
Joining us today. I really appreciate it. Again, this is part 2 of a conversation. We've already covered ancient media culture and the Apostle John, the beloved disciple, as a cultural memorian who had just a library of texts in his mind, and the benefits of that approach, how that was more common than we might realize in ancient times. And we also talked about how we as a church should learn from that, and how that style of memorizing, meditating, and ingesting the text should inform how we approach the text today. I want to bring that conversation to a more specific point, the book of 1 John. So take a second to unpack for us a bit what your dissertation was about. You talked about aural design and coherence in the prologue of 1 John. Now, to say that there's aural design and coherence in the prologue of 1 John would imply you're writing because there are people who think there is not coherence in the prologue of 1 John. So can you take a second to unpack what is the controversy or debate around the book of 1 John, specifically the prologue, and how the aural lens solves this?
Sure. And by the way, that's my published version of my dissertation. So one of my first assignments by my doctor father in my project was to read everything that had ever been written on the prologue of 1 John. Pretty overwhelming task.
Anything that's ever been written.
Everything that's ever been written.
Okay.
Alongside of, he asked me to read 2 commentaries, cover to cover, the Anchor Bible commentary by the late Raymond Brown, and the Word Biblical commentary by Stephen Smalley. Anyway, as I started noticing patterns as I was reading these commentators, and they would make they'd make comments about the quality of the construction of this opening prologue, and they would say things like, it's bad Greek, it's convoluted, it's a muddled mess, and they would often offer some kind of translation that would rearrange it. They felt it was the syntax was so poor. And there are some challenges with the prologue in the Greek. It begins with a relative clause. The main verbs don't occur until verse 3. There's at least 2 digressions. So it doesn't meet the modern standards of what we consider good writing.
Okay.
However, when you start to consider the role of a prologue in antiquity, it basically would replace what we think of today. You know, if we go to Barnes and Noble or something, pick a book off the shelf, and merely by examining the cover and the back side of it, opening up a few pages, looking at there might be blurbs. Of course, on the back there'll be blurbs, maybe a description, a bio of the author, and so forth. We got title page, we have copyright information, a table of contents. So without even beginning to read the work, we already have a pretty good idea scoped out for us as to what to expect.
Sure.
Well, when you're reading a book that is written on a scroll with maybe a tag affixed to the outside with a title, all of those elements of a modern book jacket were not there.
Okay.
And so the prologue the opening passage had to function as a modern book jacket does today.
That's fascinating.
And so, you start to think about, okay, if John is writing this urgent piece that's attempting to turn around a crisis situation with false teachers, why would he? It'd be like, so I liken a prologue to, it's like a foyer. The building we're in here, if you came in the front way, we've got a welcome desk, we got, an open lobby, kind of a lobby there. Well, that gives you a hint of what you might expect. Well, imagine coming up to some building, front foyer, broken windows, trash lying around. I'm like, why would someone start this piece that's of a critical nature and make a horrible first impression? So prologues were designed to be a hook to interest you to continue reading on.
Okay.
They would give you like a trailer for a modern movie. They'd give you a sneak preview of what's to come, maybe some of the subjects that will be explored. They would give you an idea of the ethos of the author and so forth. So I kept encountering modern scholars making these claims about it. Some even question, he's just an old guy starting to lose his mind and he can't even write Greek straight, all this kind of stuff. So I started thinking, well, wait a minute, yeah, but this was written in the ancient world and it was designed to be read aloud.
Yeah.
Maybe we're not reading this properly. We're judging it by our criteria in a largely predominantly silent reading culture. But we're not listening to the text. And so I started paying more attention to the oral climate of the first century, how books were read aloud. And another element, we may talk about this a bit later, but many ancient Greek texts were written in what's called scriptio continua, which means essentially all capital letters. Okay. Almost virtually devoid of punctuation, so no headings, bold, italics, no divisions between words, just continuous rap. And in some cases, if a scribe ran out of room at the end of the margin, so think of columns of undifferentiated text, they would sometimes rap in the middle of a word and start the end of the word on the beginning of the next line. Now for us, that'll be quite challenging to read that. But of course, these writers were trained to read scriptio continua, or continuous script. But from the perspective of someone just perusing the contents of a book, you think about all the modern typographical conventions. We got chapter divisions with headings and
capital letters, periods.
Exactly.
All that.
So we can kind of appraise the organization of a book, especially if you have a physical copy of your book, flip through it, and you can kind of get the lay of the land. Well, if you unfurl a scroll that's columns and columns of continuous script,
right? Okay.
It's really hard to figure out the structure. And so, long story short, what I started to do is to say, well, wait a minute, if we listen to how this is read aloud, the repetition of the sound, the patterns of the sound, with variation, it's actually almost like a piece of music where you might have a verse and a chorus, and you have a pattern that's established, and then a variation on that pattern. And so I started seeing patterns in the Greek text that an audience would have audited, would have listened to, and that would have helped them to divide up the text in their mind.
Okay, so you just talked us that you've outlined that ancient texts often didn't include modern conventions of punctuation, grammar, syntax to indicate to the recipients how to break up the flow of the information they were digesting. But you were saying instead, ancient writers assumed probably that most of their readers were not going to be reading this at all. They were going to be listening to a professional reader read it for them, and they're all absorbing as this one central person kind of reads the script out loud. So these ancient authors are writing probably primarily with like sound patterns as not even like a second, as like the primary way they're thinking the audience is going to be interpreting this. Okay, so if they're assuming that sound is the primary medium for digesting their work, not the text is there as a tool for the lector or whoever is, then
you're saying the written text, yeah.
The written text is there just as a tool for whoever's going to be reading it, but the ancient authors like almost looking past that person to the audience who's going to be hearing it. What kind of patterns and what kind of patterns, I guess, would a author or writer put into their work to help that lector or to help the audience understand? You're saying you're noticing patterns in First John. Give me an example. What kind of patterns are you like finding that are clues that this is like an oral piece, not a written piece?
Yeah. So I'd be forced to talk about the Greek because these are patterns in the Greek.
Okay.
But I'll use a translation, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen, which. So in Greek it's ha ha or o, relative pronoun. We have seen, we have heard. In Greek is a highly inflected language, so the endings often will indicate how that particular word, in this case a verb, functions in the sentence. So you have this repetition of these sounds, and in the highly inflected nature of Greek. So in English is a very word order oriented language.
You can't, by that you mean you can't swap the words in a sentence
right,
around.
You change the subject and the object around.
Okay.
And it totally changes the meaning, right? It changes who's doing what. Well, in Greek, like a lot of highly inflected languages, it's often the endings indicate, things like person and number and those kind of elements of grammar. So I'm going to oversimplify here, but the grammatical inflections are the glue that holds a sentence together, not word order. It's so you can in Greek, beginning Greek students often are surprised that you can take the subject of a Greek sentence and put it as the very last word, and it still means the same thing. It might alter the emphasis or something. You take the main verb and put it at the end. You can rearrange the components to a degree. I mean, it's not completely flexible, but
way more flexible than English.
Still way more than English, and it still basically means the same the same thing.
So what
And
we
so they could move them around for the sake of what's called euphony. The euphony, which is a compound of, well, is good or well, and then phony, think phonetic sound, to make it sound good to the ear.
got it. Okay. That makes sense.
Like
So,
think poetry is a classic example.
and the reason why you would want it to sound good to the ear is because ultimately these people can't take that text with them. Like they have to remember it. And so
If they're illiterate, as the vast majority of that population was,
right.
they functionally, they're unable to read the written text.
I'm trying to think of like a modern equivalent. Like if I had to urgently communicate a message and I needed somebody to remember it after we were done talking, I could think of a couple strategies. Again, knowing that they can't retain the message, there's no written scroll they can take with them or anything like that if they can't read it. I would think one, be like really clear and like emphasize certain themes over and over again. Like I'll say the same thing 9 times. Like,
Right.
and so you're gonna get it, because I know that if I just say it once, I'm risking you losing it after a couple minutes after you walk away.
Right.
So I might say it 9 times, and if you were to read that out, you'd be like, why is every paragraph the same thing? Like, that doesn't make any, like, but that makes, again, it's not for a written audience, it's for an oral audience. So I'd repeat myself over and over again. Or I might put the words to some sort of melody, like turn it into lyrics of a song, knowing that like if I make this message a cool song, they'll remember the tune, or I'll make an acronym or something like that. Like, here's each of my points, and the first letter of each point spells out a word. I would come up with something like that to get it to stick in your mind. Is this the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, you have to have enough repetition to create some kind of coherence, some kind of unit, right? So you think of a popular song. We have classic examples, the chorus. Choruses, we go back to the chorus, you repeat that, and it's usually got a good hook line to it. But we have a verses are different, and then often a bridge. So not enough repetition equals chaos, right? There's no concept, there's no idea that the piece revolves around. Too much repetition results in boredom.
Sure.
Like I've heard that so many times, I get sick of hearing it. But so if you look at a lot of the writings of the Bible, lots of repetition. If you ever read Book of Numbers or something like that, but that we're not as accustomed to that in our soundbite culture that wants change.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So yeah, I was gonna just mention here, I've got the book somewhere in here. This doesn't look like much, but it's actually a translation of an ancient text. This is part of the Loeb, Loeb, edition of this work. And this was one of the main foundations for my whole piece. It's an ancient text by a teacher of rhetoric who was from a town of Halicarnassus, which is where Herodotus was from. He moved to Rome, became a teacher of rhetoric. His name's Dionysius. And he wrote this delightful piece, which not many people know about, entitled on literary composition, or it can also be translated something like on the arrangement of words. And what Dionysius does, he's all over this sound concept, that a good writer knows how to write for the ear, not the eye. And even to the point of violating good Greek grammar, the rules of good Greek grammar, he will arrange sentences so they're good for the ear. And he cites, many examples from Herodotus, from Plato, from Homer.
Okay.
So yeah.
Well, let's build on that. When I was reading your dissertation, I'll read the question I have here. Like I put down, Jeff, you write that the scholar John Harvey has identified 8 categories of aural patterns, including chiasmus, inversion, alternation, inclusion, ring composition, word chains, refrains, and concentric symmetry. And there were more aural devices that others have identified too, other than just those 8. But you wrote down that ancient orators could be quite skilled at layering multiple of these patterns together too at the same time. And unfortunately, these can often be hidden if you're only examining the text visually. So I had no idea there was that much rich structure that was missing in Scripture. So we don't need to go through all 8, but can you pick just 1 or 2 of these structures that I mentioned? You know, everything from chiasmus to concentric symmetry. Just pick a couple of those. Explain to us what those concepts are that ancient orators would have been very skilled at layering together for ancient audiences.
Yeah, and to lay a quick bit of backdrop, you're exactly right. Ancient orators would have learned these techniques in their educational process. And I have another book here. It's called Progymnosmata, Greek Textbooks of Prose Composition and Rhetoric. My copy's kind of messed up. But
Say that word again.
Progymnosmata, the word actually means preliminary exercises. These are textbooks from the ancient world, exercises like workbooks that the students would use in class.
Wow.
Well, the first one was an instructor's textbook, the instructor's copy of the textbook that they would use, and it's full of these exercises that students would typically use as they segued from the second of the 3 phases of Greco-Roman education to the third. And the third was where students would specialize. The bulk of students would focus on rhetoric. They wanted to become a public speaker, a statesman, a lawyer, or whatever. So they learned. So these kinds of compositional devices are written about extensively. So these were their classroom textbooks. So to just pick a couple, chiasmus or a chiasm or chiasm is actually, that comes from the Greek letter chi or chi, which is an X in our language. And when you think about the shape of an X, so 1/2 of an X, it starts here, it comes down to a point in the middle, and then it fans back out as a mirror.
Yeah.
And so a chiastic structure will look something like this: A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime. So you start with a structure, a second structure, maybe a third structure, and then you go in reverse order back to the first structure. And so here's a classic example out of the Gospels. That's a sentence chiasm. And I may be misquoting this, but Sabbath, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So man's in the middle,
yeah.
and Sabbath on the outside. And when you have a chiastic structure, the center point is where the focus is. And it can be very complicated. You can have A, B, C, D, E. Right. Then there could be an F in the middle. Then it could go E prime and go back in reverse order. But the focus is that which is in the center.
Okay.
And those chiasms can range from a few words to, some scholars would suggest, even entire books of the Bible are arranged chiastically.
Are there any books of the Bible that you think are arranged chiastically?
Yeah, there's some that definitely, arguably are. Yeah.
Like which ones?
Well, like parts. Well, so like I was trying to think. Lamentations is actually an acrostic, so that wouldn't count. Acrostic. Some of the Psalms are acrostics, where a section will progress like Aleph, Beth, Gimel, and you'll have a sentence that begins with, several sentences begin with the first letter of the alphabet, and then 7 sentences begin with the next letter. And so it was a mnemonic.
I got you.
Mnemonic device.
Are any of John's writings chiastic?
Arguably, some could be. Some scholars think that like elements of the Book of Revelation are actually chiastic in their structure. Some would suggest there's studies that have been done analyzing the prologue of the Gospel of John, suggesting it follows a chiastic structure.
I see.
Now the danger is, we know chiasms exist. We know they're talked about in some of the ancient rhetorical handbook traditions. But are we being subjective or objective, which is kind of what I think one of your questions on here was pointing at. How do we know we're not just imposing?
Yeah, well, let's get to that later.
Yeah,
But okay, so chiasms are one structure that maybe they can be a sentence or a paragraphs or an entire book. But give me examples of
An
another.
inclusion.
Okay, an inclusion. What is
An
that?
inclusion. The technical name would be in Latin would be an inclusio,
Okay.
which means you start with a concept, an idea, a visual pattern, whatever it may be, and you end with it, so that it creates a bookend.
Okay.
You return whatever you started with, you work through a concept, and then you come back to where you started. So it's an inclusio. It frames
Yeah.
that particular piece. I was also going to mention word chain is another example where a writer will take a particular word, maybe move on to a synonym for that word, but maybe they'll go back to, maybe they'll refer to some Old Testament passages where that same word crops up, and they'll do a linkage, like a chain across those terms. But
So and there's more here. There's 8 that I listed off, and we're not going to go through all 8. And there's more that I didn't even mention. Go back to in inclusion. Sorry. I don't know this to be the case, but I've kind of suspected that the story of the Bible itself, like all the texts together, kind of form that, like where it starts in the garden with man and God united, and it kind of ends in this new Jerusalem city that comes down out of heaven, where there's a new garden, or like this new. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar vibes at the beginning and end of the story of the Bible. That kind of
deja vu.
Right.
We're back at Eden again.
Right. Exactly. Would you say is that a fair?
That's an example of an inclusio writ large.
Okay.
That the Bible ends with a very similar scene. These Edenic, this Edenic setting with rivers and the tree of life. Yeah, I actually thought of a really good example of a chiasm. There's been studies done on this. Scholars will argue that the Torah, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, form a large chiasm, where Genesis corresponds to Deuteronomy, Exodus with Numbers, and the centerpiece, we don't like to hear this as Westerners who find Leviticus boring, but Leviticus is the heart and center of this chiasm. Then you take the book of Leviticus, and it is a chiasm with a centerpiece. You wonder what it might be? Is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when the high priest goes into the holy place.
Oh, wow.
There's been some, I forgot his first name, Morales has an incredible study on Leviticus and how Leviticus is the centerpiece of the whole Torah, the first 5 books, and it forms, and he goes through and shows how this is it's like a concentric circle. It's a framing device that brings your focus on to the very center of all of that, the Day of Atonement in Leviticus.
Wow. Okay, so let me. I may botch this, but I'm gonna step out of my comfort zone here. So the story of the Torah, just the first 5 books of the Bible. Is it fair to say that, roughly speaking, it's the story of God creating man, partnering with man to bring order out of chaos, to redeem creation, to govern creation? Man falls. Then God goes through this process of trying to redeem mankind by creating a nation and restoring to this nation, union between God and this nation, so that they can continue the original mission. Like, there's unity, the fall. Here's all the laws to get you to go back, and now we're at the end of Deuteronomy, and you're supposed to go into the promised land and be this nation that's a light to the rest of the world, like I originally wanted to do in Genesis. Is that a fair overall arc of the first 5 books of the Bible?
Yeah, I would say with some missing pieces, but yeah.
Yes, I told you, like, I was just throwing it out there, like, yeah, there's probably gaping missing pieces, but just as an overall structure, okay. And in the middle of that structure of the unity, the fall, the come back up, that now we're back to the mission again, is this Day of Atonement, where, like, how is it possible for us to return back to this unity with God in the promised land?
Yeah.
Is this Day of Atonement? Okay, that mirrors then the overall story of the Bible, which is, we know that for Israel, like, when they got to the promised land, things didn't go the way God wanted, and they ended up being judged. But but the entire story of the Bible mirrors that same arc. And the hinge piece of our story would be the Day of Atonement of God Himself on the
Calvary
cross, like on
is
Calvary.
the middle, is sort of the center piece of the whole Bible.
So you've got an early chiasm that's like a foreshadowing of like the grand chiasm. Is that fair to say?
Yeah,
Or
sorry. I would add one of the missing pieces that I think is critical. A lot of scholars have been doing research on this topic, the function of ancient temples and shrines and tabernacles and so forth. So a number of scholars consider the creation, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, creation take 2, the second version of it, which creates what's called a diptych. They're two panels put together. You've got this transcendent, poetic, everything symmetrical creation. Chapter 1, chapter 2 is, instead of God creating by speaking, He creates with His hands. He reaches down the dirt, creates Adam. Well, the notion is that creation itself is one cosmic temple.
yes, I've heard that.
And that Eden is the Holy of Holies. God's walking with Adam and Eve. And there's a whole lot I could say about it. But part of the restoration is the return to being in God's immediate presence. So by the time you get to Revelation, the end of the book of Revelation, you got this holy city, the New Jerusalem, a temple city, descending from above. Earth and heaven are brought back together. There's no more need of an actual temple, which actually, in a sense, is a barrier between God's presence and God's people who, in the Old Testament, you had to fulfill all these kind of rituals to even be able to approach the holy presence. And so, it's the whole thing comes back together. You see God restoring, not just saving souls per se, but restoring a fallen created order.
Yeah.
That, Paul says the whole creation groans. It's
Waiting for redemption.
Right.
So, okay, I don't want to take too much of a digression into the temple, but I'm very sympathetic to the notion that Eden is like the first holy of holies. Correct me if I'm wrong, but whenever the tabernacle and later the temple that Solomon builds, meant to be kind of a stopgap. This will be where God dwells with y'all for now. Wasn't He supposed to like carve images of trees and like garden imagery inside the temple? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, there were cosmic. Yeah, you had, of course, even cherubim and so forth on the curtains and so forth. So yeah, it was representative of the cosmos and the heavenly tabernacle. So one theory by a scholar named Gregory Beale, Beale, is that ancient temples, and he does a lot of great study on ancient temples, had 3 sections: an outer court, a sort of an inner court or inner sanctum, and then a holy of holies. And his interpretations: the outer court is the earth, the inner court is the visible heavens. I look out and see the stars and so forth, sky, and the holy of holies, the hidden place inside, is the invisible heaven that humans can't see.
Okay.
And so the holiest of holies, and it's kind of a ubiquitous concept across the ancient world. These temples were the connecting, the gate to heaven, the connecting point between where heaven and earth came together.
So when this is such a big topic.
Yeah, this is
like the book of Hebrews is going off in my head right now of like I don't know if I know enough. Maybe this could be a third interview. I don't know if I know enough about like the tabernacle and the temple to give a good interview about this. But like there's enough here that maybe at a future time we have a conversation about this. For right now, let's go back to sound mapping and let's go back into ancient orators and how they would structure things in order to be remembered by an audience, not necessarily to be like most pleasing to the eye, but pleasing to the ear. I want to tie this to a field of study called textual criticism. Real quick before I ask the question, can you just give a high level overview? You could probably do it better than I could to the audience of what the field of textual criticism is? And then I'll get into my question.
Yeah, textual criticism, despite some popular misconceptions, is not simply criticizing the text or something like that. It's looking at different textual traditions, different variations of ancient text in light of the fact that they were copied by hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so invariably, there's going to be variants
Mm-hmm.
introduced in the text, because essentially no two copies of the Bible are exactly the same, because they were all made by hand. I mean, think of a shop somewhere where they make instruments by hand. Every single instrument, the product of that shop, is somewhat different because human hands were involved in carving it and so forth, sanding it, whatever. So yeah, textual criticism is the field that tries to determine essentially what the original text read, because of the fact we have a number of variants, and there's different theories on how do I determine what the original text was. Do I go with what variant is more common? What wording is more common? Do I go by earlier manuscripts or later manuscripts, and on and on and on?
Do I go by just what I want the text to say? No.
It can be a bit subjective at times.
Okay. So my question, thank you for that. My question is trying to link sound mapping to textual criticism. And again, this is not my field, but I would imagine that there could be some role that sound mapping could play in contributing to this field. So for example, if there was a passage of the New Testament where there's a dispute over two different variant readings, did Paul say da 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 A or da 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 B? Maybe sound mapping could give us some clues onto which variant might be the original. So for example, I have an analogy here in the question. If I wrote a note and I left a note behind, and thousands of years passed by, and someone was, what did Nathan write in this note? And there's two different versions that have survived of the note that I left. And one version says 1, 2, buckle my shoe, and the other version says 1, 2, buckle my sandal. Shoe and sandal, the meaning of the word, either one could be, but you could tell from the oral pattern that 1, 2, buckle my shoe is probably what I was trying to say, because you get that I was trying to make a rhyme there. 1, 2, buckle my sandal conveys a similar meaning, but that's not exactly. And you can tell that sandal doesn't fit the sound profile of what I was going for there. So is that possible? Is there a role that sound mapping can play in textual criticism? And if so, what?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much I can say. There's a whole chapter, I was looking over there if I have the book on the shelf, that I cite in my dissertation by Chris Karagounis, a scholar. He's actually from Greece. Charys, I think is his first name, Karagounis. He does a whole history of the Greek language. He has a chapter on the effects of aurality on textual variants. And so I'll just say a few different things. This isn't the only way that texts were copied in the ancient world. This was actually more common in the Middle Ages. But you'd have what's called a scriptorium, and it's kind of the old version of a modern photocopier. So you'd have the master scribe would basically, I'm oversimplifying here, but stand at a podium. Okay, we're going to copy this text, and he would read it aloud. And then the scribes would listen, write down what they heard. Well, you can imagine how at times inaccurate that might be, because maybe they misheard him. Or we think in English, the two and two, T-O, T-O-O, T-W.
Wow.
Or maybe the scribe got distracted, looked out the window for a second or whatever. There's all kinds of dynamics.
I'd take a lunch break real fast.
Yeah. So I think aurality can help us. And one way that it can help us is it can help us realize, well, okay, this word sounds like this. Maybe one of the scribes misheard it. Now, again, don't get me wrong. Some scribal activity would have been visual. They would have actually had a text here, and they're simply copying it out. So it wasn't all done orally, but it can provide clues to what may be the right word, what may be the wrong word, based on the patterns of sound. And then you have a phenomenon in Greek, because of continuous script, where a piece of a syllable of a word could hypothetically be the ending of the preceding word, or it could be the prefix on the next word.
Oh, wow.
And because there were no divisions, that was a matter of interpretation. And maybe the lector, the one who was reading the text, may have read it wrong. They might have incorrectly divided it.
Mm-hmm.
So that got introduced as a textual variant that shouldn't have been there. All kinds of dynamics are in play when texts are made one at a time. We actually have examples of scribes would append a note at the end of a very, very long manuscript and just say, like, I give thanks to the gods that I'm done. Like, they would sometimes spend weeks copying one book, and they get cramps in their arm, and it was a tedious, and it's hard for us to appreciate because we can just push a button and make 1,000 copies of something, and they're all exactly the same.
Yeah.
So we often don't appreciate the labor and the meticulous attention to detail.
But sound mapping is one tool we could use to go back and say, is it T-O, T-W, T-O, or is it, was he saying, he wasn't saying any of those, he was saying through, not to, like, and to and through sound very close, if you just like, and so like, we see that this variant says through, but we can do some,
This other makes more sense.
Yeah, exactly. And be like, okay, there probably was a mistake. Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk a bit about translation. So traditionally, as I've understood it, the discussion has been around, a spectrum of translations. On one end of the spectrum, you have, word for word translations where it looks at the original language and whether it makes sense or not. I'm going to copy this one for one, each word in the exact order over into English, and then whatever comes off the other end, that's it. Like, and that's going to render it very close to, again, word for what the original was, but it may obscure some of the meaning. Now, on the other hand, there'd be the other end of the spectrum, which is, okay, maybe we don't go word for word, but we look at what were they trying to say, and I translate the thought for thought, meaning
meaning for meaning, dynamic equivalent.
Dynamic equivalence. And so there'd be a debate over something like Young's Literal Translation versus the NLT, and we'd all go back and forth in our churches about which is better. Do we use both? Yada yada. Okay, when we were talking off camera earlier, you talked about kind of a third dark horse player on the scene of recent scholarship. You talked about it as impact translations. Can you unpack what you mean by that and for the audience?
Unpack, yeah. By the way, the third very traditional approach to translation theory is a paraphrase. So you've got literal, dynamic equivalence, paraphrase, which is even looser, a looser way of expressing.
Okay, and then impact would be the fourth then?
Well, it's not, I don't know if it's really called impact, but the essence is, so you've got scholars like Robert Alter,
okay,
who's done great work on the Hebrew Bible, and a few years back completed an entire translation of the Hebrew Bible, a mammoth undertaking by a single scholar. Another example is Everett Fox, who's done some great translation work. And basically those guys are saying the traditional way that we've approached translation from the original to a receptor language is inadequate. So the traditional approach, as I was explaining to you, is like you got a train on this track and a train on this track, and I'm unloading the freight out of this freight car, and I'm transporting the meaning into this boxcar over here. Mm-hmm. Meaning to meaning. Well, what scholars like Alter and Fox are saying, wait a minute, meaning is intimately connected to the form of the text, mm-hmm. right? So some of the things we talked about in our first session on media and things like it was spoken aloud, and even some of these things like with patterns often get obscured because the translator just wants to somehow translate meaning, mm-hmm. but they often ignore the form. So what Alter has done is, and scholars like Alter, is to try to capture the feeling of the Hebrew. in the plays on words, the sound patterns. They're trying to make the English translation sound as, for lack of a better term, as Hebraic as they can for the Old Testament, so that when you and I read their translation, we're not just it's not just a meaning, it's not just semantics. This meaning, find a vocabulary word that roughly equals that in English and we're done. But to try to convey, wow, I feel like I'm actually reading the Hebrew. I'm getting the repetition. I'm getting the word order as it was in the original. I'm getting the plays on sound, and it's capturing the essence and the impact that they're trying to reproduce the impact that an ancient reader would have had, or listener, when they listened to the text.
So when we were talking about this, again, off camera, I used the example of the word pow. If I went pow, so if there was an ancient language that said pow, I could, the literal translation would be like, what is the translation of POW like into English, and just put it there. And that's a literal translation. Okay. And that's one level of meaning you're going to get. The next level up would be to say, okay, pow was the word, but what was, let me paraphrase that. Like, what were they trying to say? What the author's trying to do is insert a startling noise. And so, maybe I don't translate it as pow, I translate it as startling noise. And that is not word for word, but that's, thought for thought, that's meaning for meaning. And so that's better, maybe, or not better, just it's different than the literal translation. But even that, if you were to read a piece of paper that says startling noise, like you're missing, you have the meaning, but you're missing the impact, because you're not supposed to read startling noise. You're supposed to like be startled.
Yeah,
you're supposed to, the feeling of being startled is what you're missing when you just communicate the meaning of pow. Yeah. And then I think you countered with an example of music. If you were to just kind of write down what was the chord progression, if you were just to write down like A minor to F sharp or something like a musical term,
which would be technically correct.
Yes.
But it doesn't convey the emotions or the mood and so forth of the song.
Exactly. Reading sheet music is different than hearing sheet music and feeling the impact. So it's not just the meaning. It's the I guess the word impact is what we keep coming to. It's the impact of the meaning as well, that you're trying to, the musicality, the flow, the feel, the spirit behind it. Is that a fair way to?
Yeah, I think that captures it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, are there any other things we should dive into in this?
By the way, I just want to mention this book is basically the method, the approach that Robert Alter used in translating, that captures word plays, sound plays, the art of Bible translation. So
I didn't have this on our questions, but I'd love to take a quick digression into another thing that's popped to my mind, if you don't mind. In interpreting ancient texts in our modern languages, we have to deal with, literal versus meaning versus impact, like we just went into. We have to understand, sometimes we shouldn't even be reading this at all. It's more meant for hearing. Not that we shouldn't read it, but just like the fullness of it comes from aurality first, not visual first. So all these are lenses we just went through. What about chapter and verse divisions that were like added in, like, because obviously you said the ancient authors, they weren't breaking things up with even periods and punctuations, much less saying this is verse 1 of my 5. Like they were just writing. Now later on in the church's history, we went back in and we added in, okay, this segment of paragraphs, we're going to call this chapter 3, and this segment of paragraphs, we're going to call that chapter 4, and we're going to say that this thought here should be broken up into 3 verses, but this thought should be broken up into 9. Whatever. All that was added later, and that can help us with our study, so we can reference it. But it seems to me that it also like segments our thinking about the text in a way that maybe unintentionally can maybe obscure some of the original meaning as well. Would you agree with that? This is just me from a layperson's perspective. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So,
what are your thoughts?
So, yeah, the dividing up of the Bible into chapters and verses is late, and so it's not original to the text. On the plus side, yeah, we can navigate around. I can say, hey, let's turn to chapter whatever verse whatever. So it kind of gives you signs, like street signs, to know your way around. But on the other hand, I think it does contribute to a perception that the Bible is made up of verses. Well, it's probably more correct to say it's made up of books that have, units within them and down to smaller units.
But those units may or may not align
Right,
to our verse divisions.
Right. So the people, well, primarily one person, but the person who instituted those, I mean, yeah, did us a service in one sense, but those aren't infallible. They're not original to the text, and in some cases are poorly placed. And so they can actually be, in some cases, a hindrance to properly interpreting the text if the division isn't where it should be. And sometimes it can, the section after the chapter division might actually be meant to be taken with the preceding section from the preceding chapter, but we've created this artificial
I know for me,
boundary.
I would, if I'm reading a chapter, I'm just picking a random thing, Romans chapter 10. I'm just picking something random. And, I read to the end of chapter 10, and then I think, all right, that was the end of Paul's thought. Close it up, have a good day, I'm going to go eat dinner. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe I literally just cut Paul off halfway through something he was trying to unpack, and then I come back tomorrow morning fresh and I start with, all right, time to read Romans chapter 11 today, and I open up chapter 11 and I start here thinking that that's the beginning of and not even realizing that this is not two separate grab bags of goodies that I'm supposed to take or leave as I want, or mix mash like fortune cookie slips that I pull it out. It's a standalone phrase. Sweet. It's like this. These were supposed to go together, and maybe the chapter division is at a spot where Paul was naturally transitioning his thought. I would hope that whoever inserted those got it close.
Yeah.
But maybe it's not. And so, what should we do about that as Christians today? Are there what resources or options are available to us?
Well, I do want to say that a sound mapping scholar that I've worked closely with on different projects, and I essentially use her sound mapping techniques, is Margaret E. Lee. And she has proposed that to really do sound mapping properly, we have to strip the text of all these chapters and verse divisions, clear the brush out, and let's just actually hear it sequentially as it was designed to be heard without imposing these artificial divisions into the text. So, I mean, you buy a Bible nowadays and they naturally have chapter and verse, and again, it's helpful to an extent, but I think communicating to people, don't take those as non-negotiables.
I'm sure there are Bibles out there that I know there are I've seen certain Bibles recently that come out and they are just, here's the book of Ephesians, and just all by itself with nothing, no subdivide. I've never explored those, but as I learn more about this, I wonder if that wouldn't be more useful for the church to begin adopting more. So
I've often thought about in Luke's account of Jesus reading in the synagogue in his hometown, and it says he found the place where it was written in the book of Isaiah. It doesn't say he turned to chapter whatever and verse and found it. So I mean, we don't know if he just opened the scroll and
scanned until he got to the paragraph.
Or they had placed some kind of marker maybe to demarcate where the last reader had ended up so he could find it quickly. But it's certain he didn't look up chapter and verse because they didn't exist at that time.
That's so fascinating. Well, okay, let's so we've talked about sound mapping and aurality, and how these patterns in the text that are modern translations, just reading itself, or chapter and verse divisions, all these things can serve to unintentionally obscure the rich patterns that do exist in the text, whether those are chiasms or inclusions, or all the different ones. Again, we didn't dive crazy deep into all the different variations of it. Maybe there'll be a separate conversation again to go ultra nerd into that stuff, respectfully. But what would you say to somebody who just says, well, I'm going to stop you there. There is no deeper meaning patterns in the text, a simpler explanation than that there, John wasn't playing 40 underwater chess. Like, a simpler explanation is that John's a bad writer and he is an old man. And, human beings are masters at imposing meaning into areas where there is not meaning really to be found. Classic example would be, I look outside and I see faces in the clouds. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not actually, that's random particles of water vapor, but my brain, my psyche craves meaning, and so I impose that onto, and I see a face, and other people be like, oh, I see the face too. None of us are seeing a face, but we're all collectively hallucinating. Essentially, we're all imposing meaning where there is none. And so, what you're doing, Dr. Brickle, and what others like you are doing is, you guys are motivated to see the Bible as this majestic tapestry of just rich information. You're motivated to see it because you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and so you have to see meaning. But the simpler reality is that John just was an old man who sucked at writing. Like, what would you say to someone who just would come at it from that angle? And that's not what I think, but what would you say to that kind of perspective?
Yeah. So yeah, I do believe the Bible is God's Word, but it's God's Word expressed through literature. So the kind of patterns that we find in the Bible are part of ancient literature.
Mm-hmm. Like they're not unique to the Bible.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And in any good work of literature, even a modern novel or something like that, will use literary devices and methods whereby it's structured and so forth. And I was mentioning, I think maybe in our first session, on the role of rhetoric. Well, rhetoric had 5 main pillars: invention. I'm giving the English translations: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And so students would learn from, fairly early on in their education how to read and begin to compose literature. So these elements, like for example, arrangement, they would learn how to put together a piece so it had a structure to it, and organizing principles where it would flow. So when Luke says, I wrote an orderly account, that means, and there's some debate, is it how much is that is chronological, is it literary, is it rhetorical / persuasive? So he's thinking about these very kinds of structures that make a piece have some kind of coherence to it. Otherwise, it would just be a blob of stuff with no order, no sequence, no arrangement. It'd be chaotic. So these kinds of principles were built into the ancient world, and one could even say, to some degree, now, am I saying that when John, for example, wrote the prologue of 1 John, that he thought, okay, let's say I need this letter, I need to fit this in? No, I mean, think about a good jazz musician who's mastered the language of jazz, who probably has studied music theory. When they get out on the bandstand and they take a solo and they play some solo on the saxophone or whatever, a master musician is not thinking of, let's see, no, I need this is the scale or mode I need to. No, because they've been training for years.
Right.
And these kind of patterns.
It's just expressing out of the normal.
So it's part of discourse.
Yeah. Okay.
It's part of.
Yeah. Similar thing. Okay. So whenever I make this sentence, I didn't think I have to end this sentence with this sentence. Like, I just spoke.
Because from a kid, you learned how to speak English.
Right. Okay. So for someone to look back, 1,000 years from now and be like, Nathan put the object of the sentence here, like he's a masterful orator, and somebody else would be like, no, Nathan didn't know it. Like, it would be going too far the other way and being uncharitable. It doesn't mean that I'm sitting here before I say something, like charting out every word, but it also doesn't mean that there isn't immense structure happening through what I'm saying either. It's just that I've internalized the structure to where I'm not even cognizant of it. It is a very rich structure that I'm expressing.
I mean, we began our interview today, you had kind of a plan. I mean, we've deviated from it,
Sure.
but you had a direction that you wanted to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And to criticize the New Testament author John, I think would be like being uncharitable. Like if other ancient works are aware of these standards and are expressing this, how much, even if the Bible wasn't the Word of God, like why couldn't he have the exact same standards as others? Now, going further, you can say there's even more meaning and beauty to be found as the Word of God, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. What you're expressing, there can be tremendous amounts of very sophisticated structure going on, even if the author isn't sitting there like with this giant like whiteboard charting out like every note of every letter.
I think it's possible to over exegete, to over analyze, and maybe the original author maybe wasn't even necessarily thinking of consciously of that, but there are patterns, like some of them we've talked about, chiasm and so forth, that were just so ingrained in discourse, the way people thought, the way they ordered, they sequenced patterns and so forth, that they may have expressed them without even really knowing it.
Well, and that would be it would also be another way potentially. Again, this is not my area of specialty, so I don't want to go beyond the bounds of what's appropriate, but like to the concept of trying to determine, is the Bible just ancient literature, or is there divine authority? Is there divine promptings behind the words these people are saying? Maybe precisely one of the things you could look for, and I don't know if you could prove this. The word prove isn't even like the right, I don't think that's the right word to even bring to the bear here, but if you see the authors exhibiting structures and like meaning that they themselves maybe aren't even aware of, I'm sure we've had the experience, like you say something and some of us, you don't even know what you just said. Like, and you think back, oh man, like there was like something deeper speaking through them with this beauty and this structure that maybe they themselves weren't consciously channeling. Is that a fair thing to start wondering, or I don't know?
I don't think it's either or, it's a both and. Holy men of God spoke as they were moved on by the Holy Spirit. So I don't hold to a dictational theory of inspiration in the sense that God just took the biblical authors and put them into a trance and grabbed their arms and forced. Now, granted, there's places in the Bible where it's a direct quotation, and Yahweh said.
Yeah.
And Moses is recording God's direct words. So for me, when Luke says something like, "It seemed good to me also," I don't think God somehow bypassed Luke's training, his skills, his life experiences, his handle of the Greek language, which I think was his first language, and on and on and on. It wasn't some robotic, mechanical, like he was just some kind of scribe, and God just like downloaded a computer chip, and he just no. It reflects the culture. It reflects Luke's particular personality, and so forth. I'll mention real quick here, one of the big breakthroughs in biblical scholarship, and there's rarely a breakthrough where some book comes out and just gets a lot of attention and scholars are like, there's a consensus formed. Well, one of those, for a long time, scholars felt like the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were completely unique. They were like a type of literature unto themselves. But the book that really changed that was a book by Richard Burridge entitled "What Are the Gospels?" I think it's called. And basically, what he did was to compare the Gospels with ancient Greco-Roman biographies. And basically, long story short, what he found was the Gospels, without a doubt, they have unique features, but they fit nicely into what we know as the literary genre or type of an ancient biography. What they include, what they don't include, the focus on the main character, on and on and on. Well, what does that do for us? That tells us that God spoke. Not only did he use languages people could understand in inspiring the Bible, in this case the Gospels, but even used forms of literature that people were familiar with. People knew what a biography was.
Yeah.
Does that make
that makes a lot of sense. I think we can. I think, and this isn't on the interview questions, but I would love to go here if we can. Um, for a lot of us who are young in our faith, I'm getting increasingly less young, unfortunately. But
join the club.
But I don't know where necessarily I got this idea. If it was just a child's understanding, or if this was incorrect teaching given to both. I don't know. But just getting this idea or this feeling that like to call the Bible the Word of God means that every word has to be true, whatever that means. Like, it's all true. Like, okay. And by true, that means there can be no error or confusion or variance. Like, it pretty much is just like straight off of God's lips onto the golden tablets, and someone carried the golden tablets for 2,000 years until it ended up at the publisher's house where they really meticulously put it into a KJV Bible, and now it's here in my hands. But like, there's been like 3 steps, but like, it's like, like this is it. And if there's any debates on anything, it's like, it's so inconsequential as to be laughable. Like, and if it's not that, if the story I just said is not the case, then like the whole thing just comes across. Then like, what even is truth? Is God real? Like, why am I doing this? Who's like, and like the entire thing just comes crumbling down. And the older I've gotten, the more I've been like, wait, whoa, like, why did I have to put so much like intensity on this? Like, if I say, yeah, like Jesus spoke this, and one of the manuscript variants says this, and one of it says this. Like, why does that have to cause my faith to crumble? I don't understand why it should. So for you as a scholar in this area, how do you can say the Bible is God's word, at the same time talking openly about variances and like, oh, this is subjective here. This is, and God didn't dictate this. He didn't automaton Luke's hand. Like, how do you hold viewing Scripture as not just good ancient literature that happened to get preserved, but as something more, as authoritative for your life? How do you hold Scripture as that, while at the same time understanding that, like, yeah, there's human error that's a part of the process, and as scholars we work to fix that. But like, how do you hold these things together without it wrecking your faith or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, the Bible is infallible, right? I believe it's God's word, and at the same time, it was given through human beings, in particular situations and in different eras of time. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I don't see those as mutually exclusive I see some kind of dichotomy. I see them both working together. And classic example, I was talking about the Gospels. Some people will look and compare the Gospels and say, well, oh my goodness. Well, one example, we have, Matthew has this order of the temptations of Jesus, and Luke has a different ordering. And for some people, they're losing sleep over that.
Yeah.
But when you recognize what we sometimes call literary license, and when you look at historiographical principles back in the day, the best practices, the writing of biographies, that was part of you had the liberty to rearrange mm-hmm. the order of things. You could arrange them topically. So we have examples of some recent scholarships come out about this, where even the same biographer, Plutarch, mm-hmm. will write about the same event in 2 different places in his writing, mm-hmm. and it's so different it almost sounds like 2 different people wrote it. But they could write about a particular event from a different angle. Mm-hmm. They could put it in a different context in another writing to bring some point out about it. And so for people will, again, they'll see what they believe is a contradiction. Well, but my question would be, is it a contradiction in its original context and that in an environment? Does that mm-hmm. make sense?
Yeah.
So not only do I feel comfortable with this divine human mm-hmm. putting those two together, but to me, they're an integral part of, well, if you want to call it hermeneutics.
Mm-hmm. Is it fair to say that God, from your perspective, God cares less about did every single exact word that I spoke in ancient Hebrew get translated exactly correctly to every single language that will ever exist on earth?
You're talking about translations?
Yeah, well, does God care about that? Or is God more caring about, is the essence of what I'm trying to say being preserved and communicated? Yeah, maybe in this variant it says, and he was full of light. And in this variant it says, and he was full of brightness. Or like, I just made up a phrase. But like, the essence of what I'm trying to communicate is still being well preserved. Like the essential message is not threatened here. And yeah, we got to translate it. We got to, and authors, as they're working with God, are going to rearrange the story in different ways to bring out different emphasis, but they're not necessarily saying anything that's like untrue. And they are succeeding at the overall mission of communicating the essence of what God is trying to preserve, even if an individual word here and there like is in question or is being flip-flopped. Like, is that fair to, I know I'm kind of jumbled that, but is that fair to say?
Yeah. It sounds like you're talking about, at least in part, about textual criticism with different variants that are in the text.
Yeah. Like,
should that because trouble us? Or...
Yeah. So what I'm trying to like get at is to call the Bible infallible and to call the Bible God's word used to mean for me that there could not be any variance. There cannot be any error at all. To be infallible means that there is no error. So if I find that this passage in an ancient reading said brightness and this passage in a later reading said light, like that's an error. And I'm getting to now where I'm like, okay, like whether it actually said brightness or it said light back in the, like the point is like illumination by both light and brightness. The meaning being expressed is very similar to both of these, and so the meaning is being preserved, even if the exact wording is now dubious or in doubt. And so I can still call the Bible infallible if I hold it to the standard of is meaning being preserved and communicated, not if I hold it to the standard of is every single comma being preserved correctly. Like, is that a better way? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I understand. So let's just talk for a moment about the New Testament text. So essentially, statistically, about 90% of the wording of the New Testament is without question. Mm-hmm. So we're dealing with 10%. A good chunk of that are variants that have little to no effect on the text. They could even be spelling variants of maybe proper names of places. They can be maybe two words rearranged. Well, when you get down to it, the percentage of words that really carry any kind of significant interpretive impact are very few. So yeah, I try to view textual criticism in a positive light. Mm-hmm. I like to look at these variants as these are early scribal traditions of scribes wrestling with the wording of the text. So in some cases, maybe the scribe knows that, okay, wait a minute, in Matthew this uses this word, but Luke uses, so I look at it as maybe even like an early commentary on the text. And instead of getting anxious, oh my goodness, there's a variant here, help, well, is this still the word of, to me it's like, no, this is the textual tradition, this is the reality of the tradition that's been passed to us. And what is the reality? That these manuscripts were copied by hand. That it was a complex process. So I just don't see it as an area to kind of experience angst about.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying.
And actually, the more we understand about ancient culture, ancient practices, I kind of think of interpretation as going into a time capsule and going back into the ancient world. We end up better understanding the text and better understanding these kinds of dynamics instead of being fearful of them, I guess.
So can I say that back a different way then? We already understand fairly well what most of the Bible is saying just because we've preserved it. The area and we're getting better and better and better as every generation goes.
Archaeology, more discoveries. Yeah. Someone has said that the farther we get away from the Bible, the better equipped we are to understand it, because there's always new discoveries, new manuscripts.
Right. Okay. That does set younger Nathan at ease. More. But it's real, Jeff. Like there's a thought again. I don't know where it comes from, but just that for something to be exalted to the status of authoritative, divine in my life, that like it has to come straight off the tablets, and I have to see God ascend back to heaven as He's handing it to me. Like if it's not that, then like I can't trust anything, and I don't. I think a certain amount of scholarly, integrity with the Bible, and if no, you don't want to overstate the case either, but walking around with a critical, doubtful, cynical spirit about the text, and can I trust that this text is telling me what the author was trying to say? Like I don't know if that's warranted. Now you could agree or disagree with the text. Whether you submit to the text is an entirely other discussion. But the fear a Christian might have around, like, am I reading something that's just wildly different than what was originally said, is not a concern, and becoming less and less and less of a concern. Is all that a fair way to summarize this?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to be careful when we use terms like criticism. If I say textual criticism, we're not criticizing the text. We're think of like critical reasoning skills.
Yes.
I think of it more of as a healthy, positive evaluation analysis as opposed to. But yeah.
Well, let's wrap up the discussion. We've talked about the patterns of sound mapping. We've talked about the Hebrew temple, and we talked about chiastic structure. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about verse divisions, and how different translations can obscure unintentionally the text. We've talked about responses to criticisms, and how to view textual criticism through the light of which it is, not as a threat, but just as a scholarly endeavor. So we've covered a lot of ground. Is there any final reflections that you think would be useful for the church to consider, to, for the average person who isn't going to become, a PhD in Greek, or isn't going to maybe be able to ever learn Hebrew and Greek enough to catch some of these hidden layers of sound mapping, that are in the text? What are some practical reflections or takeaways that we should have at a more lay audience, kind of exiting this conversation?
Yeah, I think for the average Bible reader, for me, one of the most important takeaways, I guess, would be the notion of focusing on books, getting to know books of the Bible. Pick a book, maybe a book you feel the Lord's leading you to. Maybe it's just you have a particular interest in a book. Learn about it, read it, reread it over and over again. Maybe get some good commentaries. There's a lot of wonderful reference works out there. I recommend, for example, Craig Keener has a wonderful commentary. It's called what's a Bible background commentary on the New Testament, in its second edition. Books like that really help. You study the ancient context, the literary context. It's very helpful, because I think so much of what we do with the Bible is cherry pick verses. I got this promise verse over here, or and we end up fragmenting it. We lose the sense of arrangement, coherence, structure, that this text was actually delivered as a book. And so, we don't usually read novels that way, where we just pick a sentence over here or a word over here. No, you read a novel beginning to ending. And in the same way, there's structures built into entire books of the Bible that are designed to do something to the reader. Well, if we go off on a detour somewhere, or we just pick little pieces of the text, we're missing, going back to impact, we're missing the impact that text is supposed to have on the reader. It's trying to persuade me to do this or that, to adopt or embrace a certain perspective on the world. It's wanting me to become a disciple of Jesus, so forth. I should say a world view. It's trying to get me to do something. Well, what are we missing if we just, I got my verse over here, my verse over there.
Yes.
we're missing what the Bible's trying to do, I guess.
That's a great point. I would say what I'm picking up from you is that, if I'm not going to learn Greek and Hebrew, that there's value in multiple translations is what I'm picking up, even though you didn't say that. Like, maybe there's a concept I think you've talked about with my father of triangulation, of, maybe having one translation of a passage that's more literal, Young's literal translation or something, more in that line, having another that's more like the dynamic equivalent, NIV, NLT, something, whatever. NIV is, I think,
NIV, ESV is more literal than the NIV, but
sure.
But yeah, there's safety.
Sure.
Somewhat of safety in comparing translations.
Right. And then how would somebody get a hold of like some of the newer translations you're talking about where it's more Hebraicized, or like that you said Fox and other people were coming, like, are those like available for?
Yeah. Robert Alter's, I think it's called the Hebrew Bible. I have it's big, 3-volume set. I have it at home. I often am of a different opinion than Alter, like some of his footnotes. He's got different notes, and I think he often comes across a little more skeptical than I would on different issues. But yeah, you can buy his translation. It's not perfect, but I think it's a lot of people find it to be a wonderful, refreshing translation.
Well, I think we've covered some amazing ground. Thank you for taking time to go down all these rabbit holes with me. This will not be the last of our conversations together, I'm sure. And thank you as well, audience, for listening in and joining us. I appreciate your time. Jeff, thank you again so much for everything you've done.
Nathan, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. If you found this content valuable, please consider supporting us for free by subscribing, sharing, and engaging with us on whatever platform you're most comfortable with. And if you'd like to support us financially, you'll receive premium and early access content. Lastly, please check out all the cool things we're working on by going to reflectiveecclesia.com. Thanks.